In the chaos of the collapsing world, Dr. Elias Hart stood at the helm of humanity's last hope, his eyes fixed on the sprawling blueprints of the Exodus before him. The ship, a colossal, self-sustaining ark designed to carry 10 billion humans, was not just a technological marvel. It was humanity's last chance to escape a planet ravaged beyond repair. The ice caps had melted, flooding coastlines. Tornadoes the size of cities whipped through the skies, and famine, disease, and conflict spread like wildfire. On the command bridge of the Exodus, Elias wasn't just a scientist anymore, he was a leader. The weight of the world pressed down on him with every breath. His colleagues, once his peers, now looked to him for answers. Governments had collapsed into disarray, and global elites scrambled for positions on the Exodus, many using money, power, or influence to ensure their survival. The countdown had begun. Dr. Hart, we need a decision. The launch window is closing. An officer's voice broke through his thoughts. General Mara Ishida stood at his side, her stern face betraying no emotion, but Elias knew her well enough to see the worry behind her eyes. We'll launch when we're ready, General. There's no room for mistakes, Elias replied, his voice tight. He had spent years building this ship. He wasn't going to let a rushed launch destroy humanity's future. Mara sighed, glancing out the observation window where the Exodus loomed in space, its massive engines pulsing with a faint hum. Every day we delay, we lose more people. You've seen the news. The rebellion in India is spreading. The Amazon fires are out of control. The Earth's resources are gone. Our window to evacuate is narrowing. Elias nodded, his mind racing. He knew the stakes. Earth was dying, and fast. But he also knew that pushing the Exodus beyond its limits would be just as deadly. The ship wasn't just a piece of engineering. It was a fragile ecosystem that had to be perfected before it could carry humanity's survivors to a distant, uncharted star system. But could they afford the time? Suddenly, an alert blared from the comms panel. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Hart, you need to see this. A young engineer's voice crackled through the speakers. With a grim look, Elias walked to the terminal. The engineer's face appeared on the screen, a mixture of disbelief and panic in his eyes. It's the reactors, sir. We've detected a failure in one of the primary systems. We need to shut down and recalibrate the core immediately, or the Exodus won't be able to make the journey. A chill ran down Elias's spine. He'd known this moment could come. He'd always feared it would, but now that it had arrived, there was no time to react. If they delayed any longer, there would be no time for recalibration. If they launched without fixing the issue, the Exodus would never survive the journey through space. Either way, humanity's survival hung in the balance. Behind him, Mara spoke, her voice hard. We can't afford another delay, Elias. We launch in 2 hours. You're either going to fix it or we're leaving without it. Elias turned to face the window again, his eyes tracing the vastness of space. The Exodus was humanity's last chance, a ship carrying the fate of billions. It had to be perfect. It had to be ready. But Earth was collapsing faster than anyone could have predicted. And no matter how many precautions they took, no one could predict the future. In the silence that followed, Elias made his decision. He turned to the engineer. Begin emergency shutdown of the core. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The countdown continued. The emergency shutdown was a blur of activity. Elias' heart raced through the sterile corridors of the Exodus, his mind heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. Every step he took felt like it could be his last. The sound of his boots echoing against the cold metal walls of the ship was the only sound that accompanied him. The engineer, a young technician named Jasper, was waiting in the reactor control room. His eyes were wide, filled with the anxiety of a man who knew too well that the fate of humanity rested in his hands. We've isolated the issue, Jasper said, his voice tight with tension. But if we don't fix this soon, the reactor will be unstable for the entire journey. we won't have enough energy to make it to the new system. Elias took a deep breath, forcing his thoughts into clarity. He was used to dealing with high-stress situations, but this was beyond anything he'd ever faced. The Exodus was humanity's lifeline, and if it failed, there would be no second chance. He needed to make sure the reactors were stabilized before they launched, or the ship could collapse in on itself before they even left the atmosphere. "We'll fix it," Elias said, more to reassure himself than to convince Jasper. He moved swiftly, checking the readings, and within moments he understood the problem. The primary reactor had a fault in the cooling system, a design flaw that had gone unnoticed until now. It was a delicate issue, and there was no time for full repairs. "I'm going to need you to bypass the faulty cooling system and reroute the energy through the secondary conduits. It's risky, but it's our only option," Elias ordered. Jasper hesitated, his fingers hovering over the controls. "This could overload the entire system, Dr. Hart. If we don't get it right, we'll lose everything." Elias met his gaze, locking eyes with the technician. "We don't have a choice." With a sharp nod, Jasper set to work. The room was filled with the sound of whirring machines and the constant buzz of alarms as they scrambled to reroute the power. Elias watched over him, his thoughts racing, but his resolve was firm. The mission had to succeed. The survival of humanity depended on it. As the final command was inputted, the lights flickered, and the hum of the reactor began to stabilize. Elias breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew this was only the first hurdle. There were far more challenges ahead, and he couldn't afford to take his focus off what was coming next. Just as he was about to leave the reactor room, an urgent message flashed across the console. A satellite had detected a massive electromagnetic pulse coming from the eastern hemisphere. It wasn't just a natural occurrence, someone had triggered it. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a random disaster. This was deliberate. Elias turned to Jasper. "Get me General Ishida, now." Within seconds, the general's face appeared on the screen. Her expression was grim, and Elias could see the signs of exhaustion in her eyes, but there was no time for pleasantries. "What's happening, General?" Elias demanded. "We have confirmation," she replied, her voice tight with urgency. "The world's remaining military factions are organizing a last-ditch effort to sabotage the Exodus launch. They're calling it a final stand. They think leaving Earth is an act of cowardice. The Exodus is their target." Elias felt his stomach drop. How many? Enough to cause problems. "They've already launched an attack on the last launch site in the US. We can't hold them off forever." The countdown clock continued to tick relentlessly. The Exodus had always been meant to escape Earth's dying embrace, but now it seemed like they might have to fight just to leave the planet at all. Elias stared at the screen, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The truth was clearer than ever. The Earth wasn't just dying, it was fighting back. And humanity's greatest enemies might not be the elements or the alien threat they had been warned about, but their own kind. "We need to launch now," Elias said, his voice cold with determination. "Prepare the Exodus for departure, General. We leave at once." As he turned to leave the reactor room, the sound of alarms blared once more. A new warning flashed on the display. The electromagnetic pulse had disrupted the satellite grid. All communications to and from Earth had been cut off. The silent war had already begun. The Exodus shuddered as it powered up for launch, its colossal engines roaring to life, but Elias' heart couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Despite the monumental efforts to ensure that the Exodus was humanity's last hope, something deep inside him told him that even now it wasn't enough. The betrayal that had lurked beneath the surface of Earth's final hours had finally made its way to the core of the ship. Dr. Elias Hart had spent his life working toward this moment. He had devoted years to designing, building, and perfecting the Exodus, a ship designed to carry humanity's future across the stars. But as the final preparations for departure unfolded, he began to sense the growing tension. It wasn't just the sabotage threats from Earth's fractured military factions anymore. It was something far more insidious. The sudden hush in the command center was deafening as Elias stepped into the room. The massive screens on the walls showed their departure path, a sliver of space that would carry them beyond Earth's orbit and out into the great unknown. Yet there was no celebration, there was no sense of triumph, there was only a gnawing suspicion. Dr. Hart, General Ishida greeted him, her expression colder than usual. She had been by his side for years, but something in her eyes told him that the trust they had shared was now fragile. She stood by the command console, speaking with her second-in-command, Commander Jonas Hale. Hale was a man Elias had always respected, until now. "What's the status of launch?" Elias asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "We're ready to go," Mara replied, but her voice had a hollow ring. "But there's an issue, a significant delay in reactor readiness." Before she could finish, the alarms blared again, cutting her off. A red warning sign blinked on the command console. "Dr. Hart," Commander Hale barked. "There's a breach. The reactor's energy levels are unstable." Elias' stomach churned. The reactor had been stabilized just hours ago. It was supposed to be ready for launch. This wasn't a simple malfunction. The readings were wrong, deliberately wrong. "Check the systems," Elias ordered, his voice sharp as he moved to the terminal. His fingers flew over the controls as the data flooded in. His eyes widened. The cooling system had been deliberately tampered with again. The sabotage was real, and it was coming from within the ship. "Who did this?" Elias turned to face Hale, his tone low and dangerous. Hale's face was pale, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Elias had never seen before. "We've been compromised," Hale said, his voice tense. "There's no time to waste. The sabotage was planned from within. Someone on this ship doesn't want us to leave Earth. You've been set up." Elias' mind raced as everything began to click. The delayed reactor issue, the emergency shutdown, the sudden breakdown in communications. Someone had been sabotaging the exodus from the inside. But who? "General, lock down the command deck," Elias said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "And get me security footage, now." For a moment, Mara hesitated, but then nodded, signaling to her team. "Get the footage, now." The seconds dragged on, the room filled with tension as Elias paced, his mind working furiously. Finally, the footage came in, showing a team of engineers working in the dead of night, tampering with the reactor's primary systems. But one face stood out, the unmistakable profile of Commander Jonas Hale. Elias' heart sank. The man who had stood by his side through every disaster, the one he had trusted with the ship's operations, was the very person who had orchestrated the sabotage. "Jonas," Elias whispered, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a vice. "You sold us out." Jonas' eyes flicked nervously toward Elias as the truth hung in the air. "I didn't sell anyone out, Elias. I did what had to be done." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. There was no remorse, only a cold calculation. "Why?" Elias demanded, his voice rising. "Why sabotage the mission? This is our last chance." Jonas stepped forward, his expression hard. "Because humanity has no right to survive. We've ruined this planet, and we're no better than the monsters we fear in the stars. Let Earth die, Elias. It's the only way for us to atone." Elias stared at him, shock flooding his veins. It wasn't just sabotage. This was an ideology. Jonas believed they deserved to perish with the Earth. "General," Elias said, his voice cold with fury, "arrest Commander Hale, now." The silent mutiny had begun. And with it, humanity's last hope was on the brink of collapsing, not just from outside forces, but from the very people meant to save it. Jonas Hale didn't resist as the security team moved in to arrest him. His face, a mask of quiet resolve, betrayed nothing but the flicker of defiance in his eyes. Elias stood frozen for a moment, watching as the commander, once a trusted ally, was escorted out of the command room. He had always been so sure of Hale's loyalty, his unshakable conviction in every mission they had undertaken together. Now it all felt like a lie. "Dr. Hart," General Ishida said, her voice tight with tension. She hadn't taken her eyes off the retreating figure of Hale. What now? Ilias forced himself to focus. The Exodus was still on course for launch, but the damage had already been done. Hale's actions had severely compromised the reactor's stability, and there was no telling what other measures had been taken to sabotage the ship. They needed to find out exactly how deep this conspiracy went, and fast. "Start by checking the rest of the crew," Ilias said, his tone cold and authoritative. Hale didn't act alone. "There's a network. We need to identify who else is involved before we leave orbit." Mara nodded sharply. "I'll get the security teams on it. Everyone's under suspicion now. I'll also coordinate with the tech team to do a full system sweep. No more surprises." As she turned to leave, Ilias felt a strange pang in his chest. The Exodus, the beacon of humanity's survival, was already fractured, but the mission had to continue. There was no turning back. The command room fell silent as Elias returned his attention to the vast expanse of space visible through the observation window. The launch was imminent, but time was running out, and Earth was deteriorating faster by the day. Their destination, a distant star system called Zeta 9, was the only hope left. There was no room for error, not anymore. A low, urgent beep from the console brought him back to reality. The data from the reactor systems had just come in. Elias's eyes narrowed as he examined the diagnostics. The damage Hale had caused was worse than anticipated. The reactor wasn't just malfunctioning, it was dangerously close to a full meltdown. If they didn't fix it in the next few hours, the Exodus would never make it beyond the Earth's orbit. The situation had escalated beyond sabotage. It was now a race against time. Elias's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "Dr. Hart." It was Mara again, her expression grim. She had returned to the command room, followed by two security officers holding a young crew member, an engineering assistant named Laura, and a man Elias didn't recognize, a civilian consultant who had been brought on to help with the ship's biological systems. "What is this?" Elias demanded. Lara, visibly shaken, stammered. We found them, Dr. Hart. We found a list of names. Crew members, engineers, even some civilians who were placed here at the last minute." Her voice trembled with fear, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her tone. "They're all part of it. They've been planting explosives throughout the ship, everywhere. The Exodus wasn't just sabotaged, it's been rigged to blow." Elias's blood ran cold. Who else is in on this? The civilian consultant, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, looked away, guilt and panic written all over his face. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. They promised me." Mara cut him off. "Enough. We need names. Now." Lara hesitated before speaking again, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not just a few people. It's widespread. They've infiltrated the launch command, the engineering teams. There's no safe place on this ship anymore." Elias's mind raced as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. A full mutiny, coordinated by a faction of the crew and civilians, was in motion. These weren't just isolated acts of sabotage. They were calculated, deliberate attempts to ensure that the Exodus would never leave the planet. "We have no time to lose," Elias said, his voice low but filled with authority. "We launch in less than 2 hours. We need to secure the ship, or we'll lose everything." Mara nodded. "Agreed. I'll organize a full lockdown, and we'll sweep every deck. Anyone who resists will be dealt with." "And what about Hale?" Elias asked, his voice sharp with resolve. "He's the mastermind. We need him isolated. I've already dispatched a security team to the brig. "He'll be under heavy guard," Mara replied. "We'll make sure he doesn't sabotage the launch further." The tension was palpable as the team dispersed to carry out their orders. But as Elias watched the crew members hurry to their duties, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The Exodus was a ship of hope, yes, but it had become a ship of war too. The battle for survival was no longer just about reaching the stars, it was about fighting off a conspiracy from within. With every passing second, the chances of reaching Zeta 9 slipped further away, and on the brink of humanity's last exodus, Elias knew one thing for sure: no one was safe. The Exodus was silent as Elias stood at the command center, staring at the glowing digital displays that tracked their every move. The launch countdown continued ticking down relentlessly, but the chaos unfolding beneath their feet was like a silent storm, one that could rip them apart at any moment. As the crew scrambled to contain the mutiny, Elias felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. They had one last chance to leave Earth before the planet became uninhabitable. But with a traitorous faction within the ship, the odds were steadily stacking against them. The walls that had once seemed so secure now felt like a trap. Mara stood beside Elias, her face drawn with fatigue and stress. The lockdown was in effect, but there were still key areas of the ship that hadn't been fully cleared. Every minute brought new reports of sabotage or resistance. The atmosphere was thick with fear and paranoia, and every crew member was now a suspect. "We've isolated the traitors," Mara said, her voice tight. "Most of the key conspirators are in the brig, but there's still one major problem. The rest of the explosives are in the propulsion core." Elias's eyes widened. "The propulsion core? That's where the main engines are. How did they get explosives in there?" Mara shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "We don't know. It's highly secured, but it looks like someone on the inside had access. We've got a team heading there now, but it's a high-risk mission." Elias stared at the screen. They were nearing the launch window, but if the propulsion core was compromised, it would be impossible to escape Earth's gravity. If the explosives detonated, the Exodus would be crippled, leaving them stranded in space, an easy target for anyone who wanted to finish the job. "No time to waste," Elias said, his voice decisive. "We need to get those explosives neutralized before launch, or the Exodus will never leave." Mara nodded. "We're mobilizing the engineering team to secure the core, but I need your help. We need you to coordinate the systems to ensure that if we're forced to launch early, the engines will be stable enough to make it." Elias didn't hesitate. He had designed the ship, he knew every inch of it. The Exodus was his creation, but now it felt more like a ticking time bomb. He had no choice but to take control and steer it through this storm. He moved quickly to the console, inputting commands that would reroute power and adjust the propulsion systems for a controlled burn. He had to create a buffer zone in case the sabotage had already affected the ship's primary functions. As his fingers flew over the keys, a voice broke through the tense silence. "Dr. Hart, we've located another group of saboteurs on the lower decks." It was one of the security officers, breathless from running. Elias clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. They couldn't afford this. Every second was precious. "Mara, take care of this," he ordered, not even looking up from the console. "I'm going to the propulsion core." Her eyes flicked to him, alarmed. "Are you sure you should go? It's too dangerous." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The Exodus was too close to launch. If it exploded before they could even leave the atmosphere, humanity would be gone, and Earth's final legacy would be nothing more than a failed experiment. As Elias sprinted down the corridor, his mind raced. The propulsion core was deep in the heart of the ship, and getting there would take him through some of the most volatile sections of the Exodus. He was willing to take that risk. The ship's central passageways were eerily quiet now. With most of the crew involved in containing the sabotage, the corridors felt like a ghost ship, empty, haunted by the knowledge that the Exodus was falling apart at the seams. Elias pushed on, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. When he reached the propulsion core, he was met by the engineering team that had been dispatched to handle the explosives. They were in the middle of scanning the room for any threats. A senior engineer, Lydia, approached him with a worried look. "We found them, Dr. Hart," Lydia said, her voice low. "Explosives, just like Mara said. They're embedded in the reactor and in the main fuel lines. If we don't deactivate them now, we're done for." Elias nodded grimly. "We need to do this quickly. I'll help you isolate the triggers. Everyone else, stay alert. If this goes wrong, the whole ship will go with it." The team split into two groups, moving quickly to inspect the bomb's wiring. Elias worked alongside Lydia, his mind whirling through the engineering protocols he'd written for situations like this. He knew how to disarm explosives, had done simulations hundreds of times, but this felt different. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. As he reached for the main control panel to access the explosives timer, a sudden explosion rocked the ship. The room trembled, and alarms screamed through the core. Something had triggered a countdown, but Elias couldn't tell if it was the sabotage or a malfunction in the system. "We're out of time," Lydia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Elias swallowed hard, his heart pounding. The Exodus was moments away from launching, and now it was on the edge of annihilation. The explosion had rattled the entire Exodus, and the ship's hull groaned under the sudden pressure. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting a red hue over everything. Alarms blared, echoing through the corridors like the screams of a dying animal. Elias's heart raced as he steadied himself against the wall, his mind focused on the task at hand. The explosives in the propulsion core had been activated, and every second counted. "Lydia," he shouted over the chaos. "Get the timer. We have to cut the right wire now." Lydia nodded, her face pale but determined. She reached into the exposed wiring of the bomb, her hand steady despite the intensity of the situation. Elias glanced at the flashing timer on the control panel. 30 seconds. 30 seconds until the propulsion core would be destroyed, and with it, their only chance of escaping Earth. He worked alongside Lydia, skating the connections. The wires were a mess of red, blue, and green, tangled like a web. Each one seemed to lead to something vital: the reactor's power, the fuel lines, the engine core. If he cut the wrong one, they were all dead. Elias's hands shook as he grabbed the toolkit from the side. "We can't afford mistakes," he muttered, trying to focus. "You know the drill. Green is for the fuel lines. Blue reactor. Red. Red is the detonator." Lydia finished, her voice strained. She was already pulling at the wires, inspecting them with surgical precision. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. "If we can cut the red one, the detonation will stop." But as she spoke, another tremor shook the core. A loud clang reverberated through the walls, and the power flickered. The countdown timer blinked. 15 seconds. "Lydia, hurry!" Elias barked, stepping forward to help her. The ticking was deafening now, like the pulse of a dying heart. Lydia's hands flew over the wires, but the detonator wasn't cooperating. The mechanism had been rigged to resist manual disengagement. She cursed under her breath, then yanked out a small device from her belt, an emergency tool meant to bypass security systems. "I need a minute," she said, not looking up. "I'm bypassing the override. If this doesn't work, we're done." The timer was now at 10 seconds. Elias's chest tightened with every passing moment. The very air in the room felt heavy, thick with the scent of burning metal and fear. "I'll cover you," Elias said, glancing around the core. "If anyone tries to stop us, I'll handle it." Lydia didn't answer. She was too absorbed in her task. Elias's gaze shifted back to the timer. The seconds felt like hours. 5 seconds. The last few minutes of his life flashed before his eyes. He thought about the team, the families, the children who would never know what happened to humanity. His own regrets. If they failed here, humanity would never get a second chance. Earth would be lost, and the Exodus would be nothing more than a floating tomb. 4 seconds. The ship was still shaking from the earlier explosion. Ilias gritted his teeth and scanned the core's perimeter. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay focused before the tension broke him. Every muscle in his body screamed for action. 3 seconds. Lydia's hand trembled as she slipped the bypass tool into place. She glanced up at him. "If this doesn't work." "I know," Elias replied, his voice hard as steel. "We have no choice. This is the only shot we get." 2 seconds. There was a final click from Lydia's tool. The detonation timer froze, suspended in the air, mere milliseconds away from causing catastrophe. A sudden silence descended on the room. The flashing lights stopped. The alarms quieted. Elias's breath came out in a ragged exhale. He wasn't sure when he'd started holding his breath, but now that the danger had passed, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. "We did it," Lydia whispered, staring at the still screen of the timer. Elias's eyes never left the device, for now. There was no time to celebrate. The Exodus was still in danger, still fighting against sabotage from within. The propulsion core had been stabilized, but the ship was far from safe. Elias glanced at Lydia, who was already disconnecting the emergency bypass tool from the bomb. "We need to move now," he said. "There's still too much we don't know. I need to get to the command center." Lydia nodded, her face pale but resolute. She quickly packed away the tools and grabbed a communicator. "I'm with you, Dr. Hart, but we have to be careful. If they know we're onto them, they'll do anything to stop us." Elias clenched his fists. They had stopped the countdown, but the war for survival was far from over. The Exodus had one shot left. Either they secured the ship, or they would burn up in Earth's atmosphere with the rest of the world. He didn't intend to let that happen. As they hurried back through the corridors, the red warning lights flickering above them, Elias's mind raced. The mutiny had failed, for now, but there was no telling how many enemies still lurked within the Exodus, and the countdown to launch had only just begun. The corridors of the Exodus felt colder now, the flickering emergency lights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Elias moved swiftly, his thoughts consumed by the war now unfolding within the very heart of their ship. They had survived the sabotage of the propulsion core, but that victory was fleeting. Time was running out. If the mutiny wasn't fully contained, the Exodus wouldn't survive the journey. Lydia followed closely behind, her face drawn with the strain of their narrow escape from disaster. "Dr. Hart, we're almost there. We need to be ready for anything." Elias nodded without saying a word. He wasn't sure whether it was the looming threat of their enemies or the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him, but his mind was sharpened by a relentless focus. They were too close to failure to let up now. The command center was up ahead, its heavy doors offering a final line of defense. Elias was sure that Mara would have a full tactical assessment by now. He could only hope that the security lockdown had held, and that their remaining allies were still loyal. The crew's survival depended on it. As they neared the doors, Elias noticed a flicker of movement through the transparent observation panel. His instincts flared, and he immediately held up a hand to stop Lydia. She tensed, her eyes scanning the hallway, but Elias's mind was already piecing together the fragments of information. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was off. A creeping suspicion gnawed at him. Had the mutiny spread this far? "Stay back," he whispered to Lydia, his voice barely audible. His eyes locked onto the command room's doors, now closed but still vibrating with activity. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear through the silence. There was a murmur on the other side, voices too faint to make out clearly. But one voice stood out, low and urgent. It was unmistakably Hale's. No, this wasn't part of the plan. Hale's voice said, hushed but unmistakable. We'll have to move faster. If they launch early, we're finished." Elias's blood ran cold. Hale was still alive, and from the sound of it, he had allies inside the command room. The mutiny wasn't over, it was only escalating. Lydia's eyes widened as she realized the same thing. Elias took a deep breath and glanced around the corridor. There was no time to waste. They couldn't confront Hale directly without the risk of a deadly confrontation. "We need backup," Elias said urgently. "Mara should have the command center secured, but if Hale's working with others inside, we can't trust anyone." He turned to Lydia, his mind already racing through contingency plans. They couldn't afford a drawn-out battle for control. There was only one way forward: get to the command center, neutralize the threat, and launch, before Hale's faction sabotaged the mission completely. Lydia nodded. "I'll go back to the engineering team. I'll make sure the propulsion core is fully secured and that there are no more surprises. We don't need another failure." Elias glanced at the closed doors one last time, feeling the weight of the decisions ahead. "Keep your comms open. If anything goes wrong, we won't get a second chance." They parted ways, and Elias moved swiftly toward the command room. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every step felt like a step toward the final confrontation, one that would determine the fate of humanity. The Exodus was their last hope. But if Hale succeeded in his plans, it would be a tomb for all of them. Elias reached the door and quickly accessed the security system. His fingers flew across the panel, inputting override codes, disarming security measures. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and he entered the command center. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension. Mara stood near the central console, her back to him. Her eyes were locked on a tactical map of the ship, but she didn't acknowledge Elias's presence immediately. He took a moment to assess the room. There were several officers present, too many for him to feel safe, but no Hale. He had expected the traitor to be there, but the man was nowhere to be found. A bad sign. It meant he was still maneuvering in the shadows. Mara finally turned, her expression strained. "Dr. Hart," she greeted him, her voice tight. "We've managed to contain most of the traitors, but Hale's faction is still active. We've lost control of several decks. If we don't launch now, they'll find a way to stop us." "Where is Hale?" Elias demanded, his eyes scanning the room. Mara hesitated, her gaze flicking to the corner of the room. "He's in hiding. We think he's made his way to the communication deck. He's trying to disable the communications array, making sure we can't send out a distress signal if we launch." Elias's heart sank. He's going for a full shutdown. If he disables communications, we won't be able to alert anyone if something goes wrong. We're on our own. Mara clenched her fists. "I need you to get to the communication deck, Elias. You're the only one who can override the system before he gets to it." Elias felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were so close to the finish line, and yet Hale's betrayal threatened to tear it all apart. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice hardening. "But we have to launch soon. I don't know how much longer we can hold off the mutiny." Mara nodded, her face grim. "I'll keep the rest of the crew in check. Good luck." As Elias turned and left the command center, he knew that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about facing down a traitor who was willing to do anything to see humanity's last hope burn. And Elias Hart was ready to do whatever it took to stop him. Elias's boots clattered against the metal floor as he sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors of the Exodus, each step a reminder of the urgency of his mission. Hale was still out there, working to cripple their chances of survival, and Elias had no intention of letting that happen. The fate of humanity rested on their ability to launch and to escape Earth's crumbling orbit. His mind raced as he moved. Every moment brought him closer to the communications deck, but also deeper into the heart of the mutiny. The corridor seemed eerily empty, as though everyone had retreated into the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. Elias could almost hear the whispers of betrayal in the air, the murmurs of doubt from those who didn't believe they could survive, let alone escape. But Elias couldn't afford to be consumed by that fear. He had been tasked with saving humanity, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that the Exodus made it into the stars, even if it meant taking on Hale alone. As he neared the communications deck, he saw the security officers stationed outside the door. Their expressions were tight, alert. The tension in the air was palpable. "He's in there," one of the officers, a young man named Jack, whispered. "We've tried to break through the door, but he's holding us back. We think he's got control of the system." Elias nodded, his gaze locked on the door. "I'll handle it." He could hear Hale's voice from within, low, mocking, the unmistakable sound of someone who believed he was already victorious. Elias had no time for games. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and accessed the door's security panel. His fingers danced over the console, bypassing the locks and forcing the door open. It slid aside with a soft hiss, revealing the dimly lit interior. Hale stood in front of the main communication console, his back to Elias, typing furiously. "You're too late," Hale's voice echoed through the room. "The Exodus will never leave. You should have realized by now. Humanity's fate was sealed the moment you trusted me." Elias stepped forward, his voice steady. "You've made a mistake, Hale. The Exodus is leaving, with or without you." Hale spun around, a grim smile curling on his lips. "You really think you can stop me? You're just one man, and I've already won." Before Elias could react, Hale's fingers hit a final key, and the screens around them blinked, displaying a countdown. This time, it wasn't to launch. It was a countdown to complete shutdown. Hale had raided the communication system to initiate a system-wide lockdown. "You've locked us out," Elias said, his mind calculating his options. "But you've made one critical error." "And what's that?" Hale sneered. Elias's eyes narrowed. "You forgot who designed the system." With a swift motion, Elias activated the override code he had implanted into the system earlier, a safeguard for exactly this kind of situation. The countdown paused, then reset, and the system flickered back to life. The alarms blared as Elias locked down Hale's access. "No," Hale shouted, lunging for the console, but Elias was faster. With a single press of a button, Hale's control over the system was severed, and the comm system was fully restored. "I'm not finished yet," Elias said, his voice cold and final. "You've lost." Hale's face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You can't stop what's already been set in motion. The launch will fail. You'll never leave this planet." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he quickly accessed the launch controls, bypassing the remaining security. The countdown to launch had already started, and now it was too late for Hale to do anything about it. He could feel the weight of the ship's power humming through the walls. The Exodus was ready to leave. As the final confirmation flashed on the screen, Elias turned toward Hale one last time. "Goodbye, Hale," Elias said quietly. "This ship is leaving, with or without you." The comms room went silent, the tension finally breaking as the countdown reached its final seconds. Outside the room, the crew of the Exodus had already begun the process of final preparations. Mara's voice came through Elias's earpiece, filled with the urgency of their final moments. "Elias, we're ready. The engines are primed. We can launch now." Elias gave a brief nod. "Do it." With a deafening roar, the Exodus shook as its engines ignited, sending the ship rocketing toward the stars. For a moment, everything seemed to slow, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. Elias watched through the viewport as the Earth, once their cradle, slowly receded, becoming nothing more than a distant fading memory. And as the ship cleared the atmosphere, Elias felt the weight of the journey ahead. They had escaped extinction, but the true test had only just begun. Humanity's exodus had begun into the unknown.